Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's exciting Roads to Research. We have Drs. Hilary Bradbury, Catherine Etmanski, and Niels Agger-Gupta here to talk to us about action research for transformation. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment today to acknowledge that we live and learn on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Lekwungen people, and what a beautiful place it is and how lucky we are to be here today. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Rural Roads Research YouTube later next week. It is provided with the support from the Research Support Fund from the Tri-Agencies of Canada. With that, over to you.
Wonderful. Welcome and good afternoon. It's so fabulous to see all of you in the room here. Thank you so much for coming. As Gwen said, my name is Catherine Etmanski, for those of you who don't know me, and I see many familiar faces in this room, so many of you do know me, and I thank you for coming. As Gwen just acknowledged the lands of the Kusapsim and Lekwungen people and families who live here, I just thought I would start by saying Hilary and I had a very interesting conversation the other day. And we were talking about how, sure, there are areas of overlap between decolonizing and Indigenous approaches to research and action research. And yet there are important differences as well, and it's important to keep in mind that there are differences, although we may see overlaps in the different areas of research. It's important to keep some distinctions as well. So I offer that as part of the acknowledgement that there are Indigenous ways of conducting research and Indigenous ways of education that are alive and well on these lands. And that's not what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk to you about something a little bit different, about my own journey to action research, my work here in the school, and my work together with Niels and Hilary, and our work together in this school promoting action-oriented and participatory engaged approaches to research. So as many social sciences researchers do these days, I'd like to self-locate a little bit, just tell you briefly about my background so that you understand my orientation coming into this work. I was born to a family of activists and educators, I like to say, and they trained me well. Those are two identities I hold dear myself. In particular, I have a younger sister with Down syndrome, and her role in my life has been a huge influence. So much so that in my everyday life, in my everyday experience, I witnessed how the status quo is not set up to treat everyone equally or even equitably. The status quo in that sense is something that my family and I have been driven to work toward positive change. And so that was really deeply rooted in my own identity before I even knew what a researcher was, before I even knew anything about action research. This orientation that I have a role and a responsibility in promoting positive change in the world was deeply embedded in my identity. And then I was so delighted to come across scholars such as Paulo Freire, who talked about this in the context of education, and talked about how actually education, we have this myth of neutrality. We have this myth that we just present information and people take it or they leave it or they learn it or they don't, and then the world carries on, that it's neutral somehow, objective. And of course, Paulo Freire and others like him have argued that this is not the case. There's no value-neutral education, that our values are inherent in how we communicate with one another in a classroom, or whether we even use a classroom as the formal means of education, how we choose to, what content gets included in the curriculum and gets excluded from the curriculum. All of these are choices, the ways we interact with one another. These are choices that are value-laden. And so much to my delight, when I myself became a graduate student and started to become introduced to these more participatory and action-oriented approaches to research, I learned that, it's the same with research. There is no objective. I mean, we do our best to mitigate our biases, of course. We do our best to figure out what constitutes the truth and get as close to that as we can. And yet these terms are so open to exploration in and of themselves that we need to recognize those very values that are inherent in the questions we choose to ask, the way we choose to design our research, and the ways in which we engage one another through the research project and beyond. And so I was delighted in my own evolution to come across wonderful mentors and scholars such as Martha Farrell, Darlene Clover, Rajesh Tandon, and Bud Hall, among many others, who were deeply rooted in the global adult education movement and the complementary participatory research movement. And this was primarily emerging from the Global South, as many of you in this room know. So it was this real collaboration between education, values, adult learners, recognizing that people have a stake in their own education and in their own research projects. And the people who are intended to be the beneficiaries of research should have some element of control or say or authority within the scope of the research. So I was delighted to be introduced to this paradigm. And one thing led to another. I ended up publishing a book a number of years ago called Learning and Teaching Community-Based Research with a couple of my colleagues, Bud Hall and Teresa Dawson, back when I was, prior to my Royal Roads University days. And I was figuring out different ways to share this book. And at that time, we had this wonderful visitor come to campus, Dr. Hilary Bradbury, in 2016. And around the same time, this book was being released. And so Hilary and I engaged in a couple of different conversations. One was, she said, you know what? The Action Research Journal doesn't do a lot of published book reviews anymore. We actually want to engage people in the book and in the content. So let's do a video dialogue instead. And so I think I logged in from Thailand or something, and Hilary logged in from Portland, and we did this wonderful video dialogue about the book. And shortly thereafter, she arrives on campus, gives a wonderful presentation much like this up in the LIC, and then she says, okay, well, Catherine, here's another project I'm working on. I've edited these journals, I've edited these SAGE handbooks on action research, but I'd really like to make a resource that is accessible, affordable, and available to people around the globe in a way that those other resources are not. How can we make action research or anything that kind of falls within this paradigm of action research a little bit more accessible? And so Hilary invited me to join this book project, the Cooking with Action Research. And so my colleague Kathy Bishop and I contributed this chapter about creativity in the arts and action research, and how we can engage our full senses, our whole bodies, all of our humanity through creative processes that have a desired effect of positive change in the world. Because of course statistics and numbers and information is helpful, and we know that it's not the only way to make change. To make change, we also need to address the heart. There needs to be something there that is compelling us to act. And so these creative approaches, as my colleague Kathy and I were exploring in our chapter, in our contribution, these creative approaches can really help to mobilize action because they engage people in a different way. And so that was a really nice connection there in the beginning of a relationship between Royal Roads and the work that Dr. Hilary Bradbury does, which she'll say about a few more words about in a moment. The last piece that I wanted to mention is this link between the Masters of Leadership program here at Royal Roads, which many of you know about because you're right in the middle of it just now. Welcome all of the MA Leadership students. There's also this connection between this work that we're already doing here at Royal Roads. As many of my colleagues who are not students in the program know, Royal Roads does have this orientation already toward action. We're an Ashoka Changemaker campus. We value real-world research that has a positive, tangible outcome in organizations, in communities, in the world. both in Canada and abroad. And so there's already an orientation, and in this particular program, there's a legacy of using action research because we believe that leadership is engagement. Leadership isn't one person only telling others what to do. Leadership is about engaging people in a process that moves change forward. And so there's such a nice relationship between action-oriented and engaged approaches to research and this paradigm, this paradigm of leadership as engagement and this paradigm of action research. So there's a beautiful synergy there already. And the final piece that I'll offer is, there's a increasing awareness about the issues that not only our daily lives, our own personal health, our family's health, our well-being, and not only the challenges that we're up against in the organization, budget cuts, time scarcity, staff turnover, whatever it might be. Not only is this personal, organizational, there's also these global challenges that weigh heavily on many of our hearts. We see as Niels pointed out in a presentation he gave on Sunday, we see the fires in Australia. We see the impacts of climate change. We see the opioid crisis. We see the effects of poverty. We see the effects of conflict around the world. And for many of us, this hurts. This is really a difficult time in which we're called to lead. And so this final piece that I wanted to offer, and again, linking back to this relationship with Hilary's work, is that over the last couple of years, Hilary and I, under Hilary's leadership, we've been exploring something called MICA as a change laboratory, a virtual laboratory. And this has, it's an acronym that I think has various meanings. One of the meanings that I like is mindfully integrating creativity and action. And so it's this pausing to say, okay, there's all of this overwhelming impact of the world, the stress of our lives. What are the steps we can take to slow down a little bit, to recalibrate, to engage differently? And some of that comes down to mindfulness and various mindfulness practices. And likewise, creativity or the arts-based practices, a poem, a painting, an image with your body or a theatrical piece, can help to reorient the mind and give a little bit of perspective in a way that you might not get by simply reading a report or seeing something presented in a linear way. And so this combination of mindfulness, creativity, and action, the integration of those through the MICA co-laboratory, is something that we've been exploring together in an online environment. If you think that this can only happen face-to-face, it can also happen online. And so we've been exploring how can we use imagery, how can we integrate meditation practices, how can we even make images through our bodies through some theater-based methods in the online environment? And how can we use this to address the real-world challenges that the participants in this laboratory are facing? So they would bring the challenges forward, and then we would lead people through various creative strategies to try to work through this change. And so that's some of the work that we've been doing together. The intention of my comments here is to, of course, say a little bit about my work, the work of the school, but also to link and segue into the work of Hilary Bradbury. So with that, Hilary, I'll pass it on to you. And I believe you have some slides.
I do have some slides. Thank you. What a beautiful, it was more than a segue, wasn't it? It was like, wow. So why don't we just take a minute to let it sink in. The Lekwungen land has been so welcoming to me, and the Royal Roads community has been so welcoming to me. I see you all, this is not hyperbole, I see you all as doing work at the forefront of what I believe is a wave that's coming. More and more people around the world are wanting to know how to do this work. And through my modest efforts with my modest global network, I try to get out what you're doing, because I honestly feel that it's some of the best of what we're seeing. To underscore what Catherine is saying, all these different crises, it requires a different orientation to scholarship. Not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, not, but complementing and bringing our best to that. I'm going to set a little timer. Has a bell. There'll be a story that we will come back to with my colleague Niels, who will take over from me and then lead the dialogue. But this story, in a way, starts with our meeting and spending time together. Niels is quite a master of World Cafe. Many of us knows that, but for those of you who don't, can you see him in the picture? Little star over his head. We have a very gentle competition going on among the faculty in the master's program. And in truth, Niels wins because his shoes are always fabulous. But I hope I get a little prize too for symbolic shoes. So I wear these pink shoes in part to pick up and just signal the importance of the global south in our work. So the whitest white girl, at least wearing the pink shoes, acknowledging, because people's knowledge has been around for forever, right? Forever. And been articulated particularly well by people like Pfalz Borda, Paulo Freire, Catherine mentioned. I won't list them. But what action research tries to be is an umbrella for a new way, not forgetting, but in fact standing on the shoulders of those who have come before us. By the way, 60 participants, 20 of whom were online. One of the feedbacks I get, it often surprises me, is how much we can do online. Yeah, but and that's a developmental edge, right? How do you really share space together? So this, if you walk as I do on Charlie's Trail at dusk, this is what the trees look like, right? So we can be taught by the trees on this beautiful land. Toward a developmental, participative democracy, ever-expanding circles of self-correcting. Self-correcting is a very simple way of saying what the scientific method, at least originally, wanted to be about. That's what makes it special, that it can catch mistakes and fix them. So a deep desire to do that. And what if we bring that scientific spirit together with democracy? And what if we truly understand that the systems we have, we make them up? And so therefore, if we do those two things, we can begin to bring relationships that are ever correcting and self-correcting these systems. So that's my modest vision. But it's not that crazy, because that's what forests have been teaching us to do way before we even walked on the planet, right? So learning how other systems and other peoples who are closer to those systems do that feels very important. But also there's a wealth in our own Western tradition. The names of William James, of John Dewey, they were the constructivist pragmatists. So knowledge is not about the right answer, per se. Knowledge is about being useful. James used the rather crass term, but it's a good one. What's the cash value? Because that's really quite in the face, isn't it, of our notions of science. What's the cash value? William James, a very significant player in Harvard, and hence, a lot of you love Harvard Business Review, I could tell from the conversation yesterday, because partly it's driven by pragmatic goals. So how do we become, or in a way recover, our beneficial presence on the earth? The Action Research Foundation, it's been around for about 10 years or so. We understand that we're helping things happen. You can't make stuff happen in this VUCA environment. VUCA environment, it's ambiguous, it's chaotic. What's V? Volatile. VUCA environment. But we can help things happen, not just, like that. I have this crazy picture up here, which maybe we'll talk about when Niels comes up. But a lot of the collab work that we do, we see ourselves as kind of designing ourselves and new ways of working in the communities that we each work in. So this global community for bringing people together. Here's Some of them, I hope to have 100 logos on our page within the year, but I think we're halfway there, and Royal Roads is right there. So different parts of this work are being done around the world. We can be stronger together. If we are simply alone, if we stay alone doing our work, people can often laugh at us, like, that's not science. And so to make the argument that science and democracy can have this powerful interaction, yeah, and Royal Roads becomes important in this network precisely because it does it, and it's learning by doing and transforming. The simplest way that I can communicate the work is that we bring relational space to conceptual space with a little twist. It's got to be emotionally intelligent, can't be, and we somehow move into collaborative experiment. Now that's a lot to do, and so sometimes the best we can do is move closer in these ways. Now, easy to say, what makes it difficult is the inheritance of the modernist era, which we're grateful for. Without it, we wouldn't have medicine, we wouldn't have penicillin, we'd all be terrified even more than we are of coronavirus. So great gratitude for that. And it's built essentially on a feudal understanding of how to interact. Also with the self, I would say, if we turn the camera around, the horrible things we force our body to do, all this work we do, all this stress we take on, yeah? But also in relationship with others. So this movement from power over to power with, I think it's generations of work, but that is, I think, a very important part of understanding what we're up to with ourselves and with others, and working with these early energies, these civilizational energies. Colonialism is a term I've heard a lot when I'm here. I mean, that's one extrapolation of these early energies. It's all about me, it's all about my nation, our stuff, yeah? And I just want to fit in. Now it's time for a conversation of belonging with people who are quite different or have been perceived as being quite different. And again, also a conversation of belonging maybe with the self. So I want to skip through just a few examples taking up this issue of power. So there's many ways to talk about action research. So please understand this is what one way. I want to take this issue of power and pull it through. At the same time, showing first, second, and third person inquiry, all of which I know you all talk about here. For me, the developmental edge here, it's always got to be on the edge, right? The developmental edge is the integration. So this is new for me too. So I want to talk about it and offer it to you. So in the second person space, I think it's fair to say action researchers are known best for, and when I say action researcher, I mean it as I should really say action-oriented researcher, to understand that there's many labels and people are more comfortable with other labels. Community-based, participative healthcare would be a label, right? And I would suggest that knowing each other, using each other's labels, but also understanding that there's a larger umbrella where we can feel safety and strength together is helpful. And if it's helpful, great. And if it's not. But second person, so the issue of Me Too is very real around the world. I'm guessing also in Canada, even though Canadians are very nice people that must exist here too. So some years ago, as I started to work more and more with an old mentor of mine, I understood that the space between us, the relational space, was just not clean. Just wasn't clean. It's like some weird stuff had happened years ago. As an action researcher, I don't just want to understand the weird stuff. I also want to engage a relational space around that. So I went to my mentor, and we ended up in a 3-year process writing this book together to understand what had been this weird stuff between us. It was a lot about sexuality, it was a lot about generational, what was going on for you? What was going on for me? And we learned an enormous amount. At that time, pre-Me Too, it was just a couple of months before stuff really hit. The conversation about male privilege, the degree to which patriarchy keeps sexuality as a secret that everybody knows and is totally weird about. Of course, that arises in the relational space when you're working. So, did some work on that together. Now, what was interesting was my colleague in Spain, also part of our stewarding group, said, I don't want to get into the gender aspects of it, but the idea that conflict itself, not just we're going to say, oh, conflict's a good thing, but that we can genuinely use conflict, that would be enormously valuable in my work with elected politicians. In her work, they write policy together rather than delivering policy from their action research. Makes sense, right? And that way people will really listen to it. So the idea of, in our work, turning to conflict, creating relational space, bringing the truths and opening ourselves more to what's going on there so that we can have experiments together. A quick example of first person. So you can see that the first person anchors the second person work. And there's many different kinds. I would say World Cafe is a wonderful example of second person work. But to the degree that we can integrate, we're turning to the anchor of what's impeding the relational space. So this one, Catherine mentioned, I have personally benefited a great deal from mindfulness practices over the years, and so brought that to a group of healthcare providers and worked together for 12 weeks. And I won't get into the details. It's also a published study in JABS. But in terms of learning theoretically, what I really was learning there is that when people turn to their anxiety, it doesn't go away, but it becomes much more fruitful in the space. Because if I'm aware of my anxiety, I don't kind of put it on you, so I can be more attentive to you. And so what does that teach us about the self itself, if I turn the camera around? It means the self is very much a shared space, right? And so if I'm all anxious and weird, then I'm going to throw that out on you. Or if you're all anxious and weird, you're throwing it out on me. So how do we collaborate together to clean up that space? And I think mindfulness can be very helpful there. I'm just literally skimming the surface. In terms of third person, the integration of that work that we can do together into this larger space. I was mentored by a guy called Peter Senge, and he was one of my dissertation advisors, and I wrote my dissertation in Sweden. And the Swedes, they just kind of, it's their culture, it's their Viking culture, really. They have this very listening-oriented culture. And I was I was intrigued by it, quite honestly, because it's, I would say, a cultural talent, a gift that can be useful. And I went on in my career, and when I was professor at USC, University of Southern California, which is in Los Angeles, I also became an elected Green Party person, and began to collaborate with folks at the port who are blamed for all the pollution in LA. It's not their fault. The port simply brings in all the stuff that we're buying, right? And what could we do together? How could we get the stakeholders, kind of like the Swedes do it? Like crazy lady talking about Swedes. But how could we do that? So, we literally called up together Disney and Mattel, the Barbie makers, and Waste Management, they're the largest waste haulers. Could we come together around roundtables, literally like this in the beginning, begin to map out our systems thinking, begin to understand about carbon reduction? And the answer was yes. And the simplest thing that I will say about what worked there was executives had never had the experience of talking with colleagues without trying to sell each other stuff. Hey, you want to buy my waste management product? You want to buy my Barbie doll? And so it is so lovely to provide for that. And it makes a huge dent in what's going on. The policy we then wrote at the Port of LA got shared, because there's not that many major ports in the States, got shared with the ports in New York, which was then under the leadership of Mayor Bloomberg. He's a green guy. So that's one of the ways these large things can begin to proliferate. What I'm trying to talk out loud about, because I've never done it before, is how the first person connects with the second person into the third person. Because otherwise we can receive these huge changes, right? And we don't fully understand how they anchor in these smaller processes. It turned out the reason I got so connected with the Swedes again, having done my dissertation, I left Sweden, but a guy called Svante Liefagren, he's a physician, happened to hear me talk about what we were doing in LA and thought, hey, we could do something like that and bring in patients and healthcare people, because Swedes are good at this stuff, and effectively use it to redesign healthcare in Western Sweden, which, I'm just throwing it out there, after 10 years has been enormously successful, but it takes this long. These are big things. And a lot of that is about trust building, relationship building, moving away, for example, the patients. Who the hell wants to go to an emergency room? Nobody, not when you're like on your last legs. You want them to come to you. So having mobile teams, and it turns out it saves huge amounts of money. So like win-win, when you bring the stakeholders to the table and you do it well and you do your own work, it can work well. So are you an artist might be a question we'll ask with the master students on Friday. I turn over now to the man with the great shoes who will pick it up from here because he was kind enough under the relationship that we have with Royal Roads to come all the way to Sweden less than a year ago. That was less than a year ago, Niels.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. Yes, I first actually met Hilary in 2015 at UBC when Jervis Bush and Bob Marshak were introducing their book on dialogic change. I know a number of you were there as well. It was sort of connected in some ways with the Academy of Management meeting where you were introducing the third edition of the handbook, Sage Handbook of Action Research. And there was sort of this lovely overlap, which I quite liked. To try to locate myself as well with this, my background is actually working in the area of, I particularly like appreciative inquiry. I was very much influenced by Paulo Freire as well, Peter Park, and Bud Hall, a variety of folks who were all very much looking at how can we make effective change in the world. And so part of the thing that attracted me to Royal Roads in our program was that every single student in our program does some kind of an action-oriented program or project. And that, to me, has been one of the most incredible experiences that I've had, has been working on committees and working with students. My real interest in some ways around furthering the action-oriented process has been looking at how can we engage people in positive ways where we're actually thinking about what could work. How can we get people to actually have conversations where they're genuinely listening to each other? I was talking with our students in the second residency that we're teaching at the moment, a little bit about the different layers of listening. Right? So the most usual thing that we actually wind up hearing from is sort of people downloading. Like a good chunk of this is downloading. This is our wonderful wisdom which we're conveying. But in point of fact, what's really exciting is when we hear from you, when we hear the things that you have to say. So when I heard that there was this gathering that Hilary was doing in Gothenburg, I sort of connected with Catherine and I suggested, why don't we have people have a World Cafe conversation about this? And I've been working actually with folks with the World Cafe Community Foundation, which is theworldcafe.com, around how is a method which was simply an activity, an organizational activity, now being translated into a research method. And we had a real opportunity here when 60 people from all over the world came together in terms of, all right, so what's important? Where does this in fact go? And we started looking at this in terms of, and this is sort of some of my work around where is it that we go with this, which is that in the literature now, over 85 master's projects and dissertations here and around the world are actually using a cafe in some form or another. And then we started looking, well, so what is the problem? Why is it just a few institutions that are using this? And it's because, in point of fact, this is in a serious expansion phase at the moment. So we're seeing more and more in the literature a variety of ways that this is being used. One of them is, in fact, to bring a community of practice together to talk about what kinds of questions should we be asking. What is it that we could be studying next, and then using other methods to engage people with. But this area of data gathering, and when I presented this back in June of last year, one of the big questions that comes up is, well, how does this work? Is something like a World Cafe as data gathering seen as being acceptable? And in point of fact, it really has a lot to do with how you do this and what it is that you're trying to do. And in our process, one of the things that we've actually discovered is that there are a whole range of ethical issues that start to happen here. And it is entirely possible in the cafe, as in a group method, to have issues of power over. So that in fact, some people may feel coerced and can't actually speak. But there are ways of dealing with this, and particularly in terms of some of the other pieces around data validation, in terms of action planning, in terms of dissemination. This is perfectly acceptable and appears in the literature all over the place. And of course, the other pieces here, which Juanita Brown and others have been talking about for a while, is, in fact, this is about collective meaning making. It's about how do we actually speak together, and using this as a case study. And I just wanted to include this because one of the pieces around the conversation of is how does action-oriented inquiry and applied research, like how is that important? How is that useful? Well, actually, we've seen a number of studies that have now come out which actually are really critical. This Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out had one of the people, Karen O'Brien, was actually part of the gathering in Gothenburg, and has been part of some of the other writings that's been going on involving Hilary, and has been really important. This piece here around call to action research for transformations is in fact saying we need people's voices. If we want to be effective in terms of any kind of change, there needs to be some way to encourage people to speak. So these were some of the topics that came up in terms of how one might actually create a range of activities through action-oriented work. But I want to actually not talk. I want to actually have you talk. I would like to actually ask you and invite you to be part of, this is sort of a one-round World Cafe. And I actually realized that one of the things that I do because of my background in cafe is that I apply the principles of World Cafe to the liberating structure 1240, which is actually quite an interesting piece. Some of those principles aren't actually identified in the liberating structures book, but that's okay. What I would like you to do right now, and we have all of about just under 20 minutes, take about a minute or so and just jot down a few thoughts here in terms of, so what kind of action-oriented inquiry for transformations or art could we be doing? Could you be doing? Right? And then how might we link that together in some kind of a connected way? Like what is it that you're doing and seeing in your community that might be possible? Or you're already doing this, right? For those of you who are in the second residency, this should be actually easy. All of your capstone projects are already doing this.
Any final comments?
Yeah, I
Niels?
do actually, and that is, I happen to like Maya Angelou's thought that you may not remember what I say, but you will remember how I make you feel. Right? So heart, and the affect is really critical. How people are feeling about something is part of the dynamic of what's actually possible. Because if you're not tapping into that and you're just thinking about this in terms of surface level opinions or facts. Facts are relative, right? Particularly in the social domain, which we're all working in. And with that last sort of comment, I want to throw it back and thank you very much for your time and effort and energy and your interest in this area. And thank you so much, Hilary, and thank you, Catherine.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for coming.